number 10, we have Mindworm. First introduced in 1974's Amazing Spider-Man number 138, Mindworm is a mutant who has the ability to absorb the psionic energy from his targets and sap their energy, and absorb that energy for himself. The first time he uses this power is on his own mother, who he accidentally kills by draining all of her energy in one go. This traumatic event drives his father into shock, causing him to run into traffic, killing him as well. Mindworm has a tough life in and out of orphanages and homeless shelters, and eventually has a run-in with Peter Parker while he's living in a neighboring apartment. But when Parker notices Mindworm's attempts at draining his psionic energy, he knocks out the villain, who is then taken to prison. Soon after this, Mindworm reforms and becomes good, but is killed by a street gang after having never actually killed anyone using his powers other than his own mother. Honestly, it's a really sad story, and I don't know why they had to do him that bad, but that's Mindworm. Pretty obscure. At number 9 is Spidercide. First introduced as Spider-Man in the Clone Saga, Spidercide appears as a super jacked, massive version of Spider-Man that has Ben Reilly and Peter Parker wondering even more who the real Spider-Man is. But soon, this third Spider-Man soon goes mad and becomes Spidercide, attacking the other heroes in a raving frenzy. He seems to be capable of some pretty nifty shape-shifting, as though he has some kind of symbiotic physiology, but ultimately he's left in the annals of the 90s and not really revisited again after the Clone Saga. My best guess is that he was just too OP and or confusing as a character. At number 8 is the Living Brain. This is one of the oldest Spider-Man villains in general, and especially on this list, and one that very few people ever reference these days. First introduced in 1964's The Amazing Spider-Man number 8, the Living Brain is a supercomputer that continually gets hacked by villains to attack Spider-Man and the people of New York City. Basically, this is what the height of AI looked like back in the 60s, making this villain not just obscure in the world of Spider-Man comics, but in the real world as well, as we are now in 2022. He looks like a dishwasher with arms, if we're being honest. But he sort of makes his rounds a little more than one might expect such a silly villain to. So I held him back on the list a little bit. At number 7 is Typeface. This guy really confuses me because although his name is ridiculous and he doesn't actually have any powers at all, he still shows up a decent amount in various comics. First appearing in the year 2000, Gordon Thomas is radicalized after he returns from the Vietnam War and his wife immediately leaves him, taking their child with her. He then becomes a sign maker and goes off to be a criminal with letters drawn on his face. And he actually defeats Spider-Man during their first encounter by throwing letters at him, which doesn't make any sense to me, honestly. But what's even weirder is that he returns as a good guy during the Civil War Frontline storyline and fights alongside some pretty well-respected heroes like Battlestar and Solo, before he's ultimately killed by Venom while facing off against the Secret Avengers. At number 6 is the Ringer. This is one of those characters that we can basically assume was named before his powers were decided, because ultimately it's a pretty ridiculous power and suit design, especially in the early days. He basically just shoots rings at his enemies, which can do anything between entrapping the target to exploding on impact to freezing. The first time we really encounter the Ringer, he's taken out pretty quickly by not Spider-Man but Nighthawk, losing some teeth in the battle and spending a lot of time in jail. He's then eventually killed by Scourge when he's called to a bar with a group of other villains, which ends up being a trap. Later, however, it's revealed that he doesn't actually die and is revived by AIM agents who give him a cyborg body, and he's renamed Strikeback. With a big enough power boost and a totally different mantle to make him a whole different character from the Ringer is essentially lost to obscurity, making him one of the most long-lost Spider-Man villains of all time. At number 5, we have Frank Oliver, aka Kangaroo. This guy's power is basically artificially enhanced legs. And aside from that, he's just known to be a very skilled boxer who is banned from the sport after seriously injuring one of his opponents. But the way that he gets this sort of lame jumping power is when Jonas Harrow approaches him and offers him the powers in exchange for his cooperation in a highly dangerous heist. While he's infiltrating the Hudson nuclear laboratories to steal some radioactive something or other, Spider-Man swoops swoops in to try and stop him. Well, not stop him, but to save his life, because the room he's breaking into is so radioactive that it disintegrates him immediately upon entry, and Spider-Man watches on in horror as this happens. The Kangaroo mantle has a couple other appearances, but as far as I'm concerned, this event marks the end for the villain and leaves him behind in the void of obscurity. At number 4 is Walrus, another very strange villain based on an animal that seems to have been picked out of a hat. This New York City carpenter's journey in petty crime starts when his uncle gives him powers that marginally increase his strength, speed, and stamina. He takes on the mantle of Walrus and is first shown battling the Defenders in issue 131 in 1984. But he's taken out by a good guy version of Frogman, who at the time is understandably a less respected member of the Defenders. So it really hits home that Walrus is not to be taken seriously, and it also suggests that he was probably never meant to last very long in the first place. Years later, there is an interesting run-in with Deadpool where Walrus gains quite a power boost and actually almost kills Deadpool, but all things considered, he is largely known to be lost to obscurity like the rest on this list. At number 3 we have Big Wheel. Originally taken on by Jackson Wheel, the mantle of Big Wheel is started when he owes money to Rocket Racer, who continues to hound him for payment. So he decides to have an enormous, extremely durable wheel crafted, which is outfitted with machine guns and can be commandeered by a driver. But his first big attack on Rocket Racer goes wrong, and Spider-Man just kind of watches it all go down. Basically, it ends in Big Wheel careening into the Hudson River. But he survives because the wheel is airtight, so he had that covered. Later, Big Wheel reforms himself and even teams up with Spider-Man at one point. Honestly, he's actually somewhere between obscure and quite prevalent depending on how you look at his legacy, because even though he seldom ever appeared in the Spider-Man comics, he has gone down as one of the most enjoyed obscure villains among Spider-Man fans. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Hypno Hustler. This guy is first introduced in 1978 and has a pretty short shelf life, like 1 issue short. Maybe with a couple more later on, but that's his main introduction. That's the only time we really see him. His powers are basically that he can hypnotize audiences at his shows using his hypnotic guitar. Playing alongside his band, the Mercy Killers, Hypno Hustler is first caught taking money and valuables from others in the audience at what appears to be their own will. But alas, it is hypnosis. He's also got these hypno boots that emit knockout gas and have retractable knives built into them as well. It's fair to say that this villain doesn't last very long and is sort of left in the dust after this first encounter with Spider-Man. Later, Hypno Hustler has a brief stint with Villainon, which is Villains Anonymous, where he tries to reform alongside the likes of Armadillo and Big Wheel himself. But that's basically it. At number 1 is Video Man. This guy's a double whammy because he is himself a rather obscure villain, all things considered. But also the technology that this character was designed in reference to is also obscure in itself, so I felt I had to put him at number 1 on the list. In fact, Video Man was abandoned so quickly by writers that his origin story is never even revealed. First appearing in the first issue of 2006's Spider-Man Family featuring Amazing Friends, he is quickly taken out after his first encounter and reduced to a little processor unit, which Spider-Man says he keeps in his freezer until, I guess, the present day, so as not to reawaken Video Man. What strikes me as strange about Video Man is that he was conceptualized in 2006, but his style is clearly referential to video games or maybe TV from the 80s or 90s, so just a total miss all around. And we're yet to see him again after his first fateful encounter in 2006. Leapfrog. This spring-loaded villain appears in the What If that has Aunt May gaining Spider-Man's powers instead of Peter Parker. And before you jump down my throat, Leapfrog does appear in other comics first, I know this, actually first showing up in Daredevil number 25, but this iteration of the character is clearly meant to be more slapstick and ridiculous than he normally is, which is saying a lot, considering this must be one of the silliest villains in Marvel. But case in point, his first appearance in this What If issue shows him crashing through a brick wall and just swearing at everybody, screaming expletives as he bounces past a group of civilians and a news reporter. He ends up in a battle with Aunt May's Spider-Woman and gets thwarted by nothing other than a stretchy mass of dough that Aunt May uses to lasso him into a tree. He's just clearly such a dumb villain and appears for what I could only imagine was comedic value to the already hysterical What If issue.
Number 9. Ghost Grandpa. While technically Ghost Riders are supposed to be heroes, this one doesn't seem to be too nice in terms of the brief glimpse that we see of him. And it's because of that I decided to include him as a kind of like a low-key villain. Ghost Grandpa makes his appearance in the 1977 What If series in issue number 34, where we ask the question, what if Ghost Rider had possessed someone else? Instead of Johnny Blaze, of course. The answer allows us to take a look at a few different candidates, including Ghost Skater and Ghost Baby, but while both talk about punishing evildoers and getting vengeance, Ghost Grandpa only seems to be interested in getting revenge on his nurse for delaying his glass of warm milk.
Number 8 is Wolverine, Lord of Vampires. This villain is bizarre because it's the embodiment of a character we've all known forever, but who doesn't really exhibit any of his typical traits. In What If number 24, Wolverine takes on the Lord of Vampires, who tries to bite him to turn Wolverine into a vampire himself. And since Wolverine was too badass to simply be turned into a vampire, he decides it's only in his character to kill the guy. And he does, but what happens when you kill the Lord of Vampires is that you take on the title yourself. And this is when Wolverine starts to change into a very strange version of himself. Right away, Wolverine starts turning his former friends into vampires, with his demeanor totally shifting as he uses like mind control powers on them, which is just pretty strange on its own. Honestly, this is what it is. It's just weird seeing Wolverine without any level of humanity in him anymore. Something about this transformation doesn't seem right and gives me some very conflicting feelings towards the whole thing. Although I gotta say, he does turn out to be pretty powerful Lord of Vampires. He even takes out Doctor Strange in a harrowing battle, which says a lot for Wolverine on its own. This suggests that his power level is pretty heavily increased after getting the title of Lord of Vampires. Doesn't change the pop collar and bat-eared hairdo though. This is a list about weird villains, not powerful ones. Although he might end up on both, he still ranks on this one for sure. I mean, just look at him.
Number 7. Scorpina. Scorpina was known for being one of Rita Repulsa's most capable enforcers in the television show Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and the same can be said for her comic book counterpart. In fact, I'd even say that Scorpina is a bit more ruthless in the comics, in my opinion. She ends up becoming a somewhat reluctant and sassy ally later on, but starts out as a strong and menacing villain to the Power Rangers. Scorpina is known for her determination, expert fighting skills, and her intelligence. She initially is presented as a major enemy for Tommy Oliver, the Green Ranger, as he struggles to fight against Rita Repulsa's influence and hold over him. Scorpina would also go on to work alongside Lord Draken, the evil alternate future version of Tommy, and would later succeed him as the leader of his army.
Danger. This villain is definitely a weird one. It's basically just the humanoid form of the Danger Room, a highly sophisticated computer interface that the X-Men used to train. But in 2009's astonishing X-Men number 9, the Danger Room comes to life and takes on a humanoid form that calls itself Danger. Although I know this isn't a What If issue, in 2010's What If Astonishing X-Men number 1, Danger gets a more focused storyline, and it's even weirder than you might expect. Basically, Ultron somehow catches wind that Danger has come to life and falls in love with her. They become a couple and go on a murder spree, killing all the X-Men and then eventually Professor X himself. Then they take to the cosmos and continue to kill all the organic life forms in their path, until they finally establish their own intergalactic empire. It's later pondered by the Watcher that if Professor X had only listened to Danger when she declared that she had gained sentience, she wouldn't have been so inclined to take him down. It's sort of a cool message about the dangers of AI, but first and foremost, it's just a weird antagonist in this What If issue. The Danger Room gets married to Ultron. It doesn't get much weirder than that, I don't think.
Number 5. Ruby Thursday. Ruby Thursday is a super weird villain who I still can't even really believe to this day actually exists. But she does. I believe she was kinda designed as a character on a dare, but don't quote me on that story, as it's just something I remember reading somewhere. I didn't have time to go back and double check all that, but I'm pretty sure her creation story is something like someone dared someone to create a thing. It's a good story if you want to go check it out. Her creation is credited to Steve Gerber and Sal Buscema, and she first appeared in Defenders issue 32 in the 70s. Her whole thing is that she is a sexy villain lady, but in the place of where her head should be, she instead has a big red ball that is made up of organic circuitry and thereby gives her powers, while also acting as a stand-in head, because you still need a head to do things, so yeah.
At number 4 is Cable. So in this two-part What If issue, Cable is the bad guy and he actually kills his parents, Cyclops and Jean Grey, as well as Professor X. Professor X seems to be getting a lot of heat on this list. And even though this is a what if and basically anything goes, it's just a really bizarre call to have part of the X-Men family travel through time to kill his parents and their noble mentor Charles Xavier. This naturally doesn't go unnoticed and actually starts an all-out war between the X-Men and the X-Force. And while these two groups are duking it out, Maggie Neato takes the opportunity to take control of Washington, D.C., which segues into that second part I mentioned, aptly named What If Maggie Neato Took Over the USA. But regardless, this just made me feel weird to see a character we're used to seeing as a hero just take a sudden turn to evil, so much to the point where he kills his own flesh and blood in a brutal massacre. And why? Well, they have some differences in ideology, but why does that matter if they're in the past? Couldn't Cable have just stayed in his own time and believed in stuff over there? Although he's not really known to stay in his own time very often. It's just that he normally does it for good instead of doing it to start a massive war that ends in Sentinels dropping nukes on Washington and killing everyone. I don't know, was it worth it, Cable? Check out the issue and see if you think.
Number 3, Dracula. I think Dracula is a really important villain of Vampirella's to talk about since he also just surprisingly married her. In Priest's Vampirella series, he had these two longtime enemies tie the knot recently, shaking things up completely. I know when I heard about this going down, I was like, what? Actually, a lot of Priest's run has been shaking up the status quo and the world of Vampirella in interesting, exciting, and of course, bloody ways. Of course, the version of Dracula we see in this series isn't the conventional one that you're used to seeing when it comes to Vampirella's comics. This version of Dracula is a reincarnation that is attempting to cheat fate by marrying Vampy, thereby altering his destiny and hopefully saving his life. For years in the comics though, Vampirella's nemesis Drac was often posed as the lord of a bunch of evil vampires, with all the vampires kind of coming from his blood lineage being corrupt in some way. It was like he only made bad vampires. That was like a whole thing. Dracula has also been shown in the past to be an exiled vampire from the planet Draculon, Vampirella's home world. Of course, Dynamite isn't the only publisher to feature Dracula. While we might be focusing on the Vampy version and his long history there, Dracula has also appeared throughout multiple different series spanning across various different publishers. And if you're like, man, but I already knew about Dracula, I don't know if you knew about his connection to Vampirella, but now you do! Yay!
Number 2 is Dazzler. In What If number 33, the question is asked, what if Dazzler had become the Herald of Galactus? These days, Dazzler is known to be a relatively stagnant member of the X-Men and doesn't usually get a lot of mention in the mainstream. Sorry, Amanda. Amanda really likes Dazzler. However, in the 80s, it was a totally different story. Right before this issue of What If in 1981, Dazzler is taken on by Galactus as his herald, but only to complete a quick mission to retrieve his original herald. Then she goes back home. But fast forward 1 year later to 1982, and in this What If, the situation is revisited again, but in this case, she stays as his herald and actually becomes one of the most powerful villains in all the cosmos. The Herald of Galactus is an individual imbued with part of Galactus's power cosmic, and their job is to fly around the cosmos and look for planets for Galactus to consume. So it's a pretty big deal to be given the title of Herald, both for the one who's selected and for the people of the cosmos, because if you're doing your job right as a herald, you'd best believe you're ruining and ending the lives of countless others. So, for Dazzler, of all the heroes to be taken in by Galactus and given this responsibility, it just leaves me with a weird feeling in my gut. Like, why would a character that barely wants to be a hero and only really wants to sing, like why would they take on the job of Herald of Galactus? The answer does lie in this issue, but it's still a bit confusing and maybe a bit out of character for Dazzler, which is why I put it at number 2.
Number 1, Susie Richards. In issue number 30 of the 1989 What If series, Susie, Reed and Sue's second child, becomes the villain. Susie is obviously meant to be a stand-in for Valeria Richards, who we have now, their daughter, who has a weird history where she was kind of both the oldest and then like the youngest child of the fantastic duo. It's confusing, but don't worry about it. In this version of the story, she is most definitely just the younger, but despite being the younger sibling between her and Franklin, she still terrifies her brother, who in the main continuity was once known for insanely powerful reality warping abilities. Although I don't think he has those in this reality. But anyways, you know you're scary when you're scaring Franklin. Even a young Franklin. Susie is an evil little girl who it turns out was possessed by a hellspawn that came from the negative zone. In the end, Franklin is forced to fight and defeat her, but unfortunately all too late, as the rest of his family has already been killed by her. Even Dr. Doom doesn't stand a chance against the possessed Susie. Poor Franklin, he warned everyone, but they didn't listen.
And at 10, Werewolf by Night. The first time we've seen Moon Knight in the comics actually wasn't in his own series, but rather Werewolf by Night number 32. He faced off against Jack Russoff, aka Werewolf by Night, making Russoff his enemy. However, technically, Moon Knight was the villain in this scenario, hence its placement at number 10. Jacob Russoff is a werewolf, but unlike his dad, also a werewolf, Jack could control when and where he would transform, not just under a full moon. He had much more control over his abilities in werewolf form as well, except for when there was a full moon, because that's when Jack would be at his strongest but also completely out of control, which is a concept that sounds a lot like a D&D character. His superpowers include werewolf physiology along with superhuman strength, speed, durability, agility, stamina, a healing factor, and of course a hairy body packed with a nasty set of teeth and killer claws, something the ladies love. And at 9, Morpheus. Morpheus first appeared in Moon Knight number 12 back in the early 80s, and he's one of the rare horrifying characters that people actually feel sympathy for. Despite his vampiric appearance, he should not be mistaken for Morbius. This is a different person. The character who's getting the standalone movie, no one knows what universe it's in. Yeah, Morbius is indeed a pseudo-vampire, while Morpheus is something else entirely. His real name is Robert Markham, and he got sick from an old virus that caused segments of his DNA to be inhibited by the virus. He sought medical attention, and Dr. Peter Alron gave him an untested drug to help him, but it all backfired, causing Markham to change dramatically appearance-wise while also taking away Markham's need for sleep and giving him unfathomable psionic powers. However, the lack of sleep rendered him crazy, after which he had taken the alias Morpheus after the Olympian god of dreams. With his newfound powers, Morpheus sought revenge upon Alron, only to encounter Moon Knight in the process. And at 8, Count Nefaria. While Count Nefaria wasn't purely evil at first, his desire for more wealth and power is ultimately his downfall, and he's very nefarious. He has been around for years and years, fighting almost every single Avenger he can think of. He also encountered Moon Knight after Mark Spectre moved to LA and joined the West Coast Avengers, primarily becoming his villain. Count Nefaria is immortal and has an unfathomably strong healing factor, because, you know, he's immortal. He received energy projection from the Living Laser, strength from Power Man, and speed from Whirlwind, all amplified 100 times. He can lift well over 100 tons, fly over 5,000 miles per hour, teleport, leech another person's energy, and so much more. However, it's likely that if you are a fan of Moon Knight, you knew about this guy, so he's not very high on the list. But honestly, not having known much about Moon Knight before this list, aside from he looks frickin' awesome, all these villains are pretty new to me, so it's pretty cool getting to see all the characters that this guy has faced, and hopefully you at least hear about a few that you didn't know about. But no complaining if you're a Moon Knight superfan, okay? That's not allowed. That's cheating. And at 7, Dead Zone. There are a few characters more 90s than Dead Zone, but he has his appeal. Dead Zone sort of emulates the classic Iron Man villain Whiplash with his electrical whips, but he's less a mercenary than just an ideological warrior. He seeks to punish sinners by lashing them to death, that has him run afoul with Moon Knight. Dead Zone first appeared in Moon Knight's solo title and is pretty evenly matched for the character. When Moon Knight tried to take him down with his adamantium, Dead Zone catches it and then turns it around on him. There is very little on the wiki about him, and honestly I don't know what else I could say about him, but he's trying to do what Moon Knight does, but going about it in an absolutely abysmal way. Like, come on bro, really? Whips? Like, I get that they're OP in like the Spider-Man PS4 game, but seem seriously underpowered in real life or in comic books, unless they need them for plot or you're into that kind of thing. And at 6, Black Spectre. Carson Knowles was a veteran who returned home without applause. His job had been passed on and his wife left him with their son. He barely got by as a delivery man and found out his son was killed by foam. After his car was stripped for parts and a mugger accosted him, Knowles snapped and beat the man nearly to death. Seeking to destroy the city that treated him so badly, Carson Knowles ran as a dark horse candidate for mayor on his father's name and political connections. He also created a second identity as Black Spectre, beating and blackmailing the local precinct boss to support Knowles, and then in a fight with Moon Knight his mask slipped, but Moon Knight was unable to convince anyone that the mayoral candidate Knowles and Black Spectre were the same person. Eventually though, Moon Knight defeated Black Spectre in public, and his assistant Marlene Arlone uncovered Knowles' corrupt plans for the city and his political office. So at least he lost. Halfway through into number 5, Shadow Knight. Shadow Knight's real name is Randall Spectre, Mark's younger brother. He was envious of Mark his entire life, which turned him into a horrible criminal. There was a murderer on the streets killing nurses called the Hatchet Man, so Moon Knight used his girlfriend Marlene as like bait to catch the killer. The plan worked, but Marlene perished. Yeah, and to make matters even worse, the Hatchet Man was revealed to be Randall. Randall later joined the cult of Khonshu, which ultimately resulted in him receiving the same powers as his brother Mark. However, he ended up choosing to use them for evil, donning the pseudonym Shadow Knight. Because, you know, every character needs to have a reverse version of themselves. Reverse Flash, Dark Archer, Bizarro. It was devastating for Mark to fight his brother and ultimately kill him by slitting his throat with a throwing crescent. Yeah, it doesn't get much worse than that, especially when you learn that Mark tried protecting Randall their entire lives. But then again, he killed your girlfriend, so...
Number 5, Emperor Joker. Mr. Mxyzptlk has an extreme level of power, like I said. Also, like I said, if this power fell into the wrong hands, it could be potentially reality ending. Now, what hands could be worse than the psychotic hands of Batman's arch nemesis, the Joker? Well, that's exactly who gets the power in the Emperor Joker storyline. Mr. Mix gets bored and wants to give Joker 1% of his power, just to see the tricks Joker is able to pull off. But instead, the Joker tricks Mr. Mxyzptlk into giving him 99.9% of his power instead. Joker uses this power to rewrite all of reality to become his sick, twisted dream world. He eats the whole population of China out of a Chinese food container box. He keeps everyone stuck in a time loop, including Batman, who he introduces to the afterlife over and over every day forever. Oh, and he also turned Flash into a slow-moving Abyss Man. Superman, the Spectre, and Mr. Mxyzptlk, being the only ones who can remember the former world, tried to do something about this all-powerful Joker. But that's just the problem. He is all-powerful. He destroys all of reality, but he can't bring himself to destroy Batman fully. And because of this, he loses control of his power, allowing the Spectre and Mr. Mix to steal it back and fix all of reality. This story it's pretty nuts. Number 4, Condiment King. When the villainous Condiment King came on the scene, it was literally on the scene, as he appeared in the animated Batman TV show from 1992. One of the best, honestly. Condiment King was Buddy Stantler, a comedian who was brainwashed by the Joker into becoming a villain who wields condiment squirters and viciously horrible puns. I knew you'd catch up to me sooner or later. How I've relished this meeting. Come, Batman, let's see if you can cut the mustard. Diabolical stuff like that. The puns get even worse in the comics, with his real name becoming a pun on its own. Mitchell Mayo. He isn't taken seriously by anyone. His weapons don't actually project his condiments at a speed fast enough to do anyone harm, but they sure are inconvenient, leaving nasty stains in your superhero costume. On the other hand, he does potentially have the ability to be able to cause anaphylactic shock if he is battling someone with an allergy, right? Number 3, Monsieur Mallah and the Brain. Monsieur Mallah is described in his wiki as a militant, super-intelligent French gorilla. The Brain, on the other hand, is described as a genius French scientist and master criminal who exists as a disembodied brain. So, those two descriptions are interesting enough on their own, but when I tell you the French militant gorilla and the disembodied brain are an item together, I think that just elevates the whole thing to a different level. Together, they are the primary leaders of the Brotherhood of Evil, who were villains to both the Doom Patrol and the Teen Titans. They both appeared in Doom Patrol 86 in 1964. Now, Brain was once a scientist who experimented on the gorilla who would become Mallah, which would increase Mallah's intelligence. An accident injured Ernst, and Mallah had to remove Ernst's brain and place it in a technological holding thingamajig to keep him alive and be able to communicate. The two are almost always together, with Mallah carrying around the brain. Hey, look, I don't judge. You find love where you find love, but as a concept for supervillains who lead a team of supervillains, you gotta admit, it's pretty odd to say the least. Number 2, Animal, Vegetable, Mineral Man. Let me repeat that for all those in the back who may not have heard. Animal, Vegetable, Mineral Man. I don't really have a problem with 2/3 of that. I just get really hung up on the vegetable part. Is that weird? Sven Larsson is the man who claims that title. And while it is a completely ridiculous one, it is actually pretty fitting. Sven fell victim to an experiment of his own making, which allows him to transform into any animal, vegetable, or mineral, either partially or fully, although he very obviously likes to do a bit of all three at the same time, which is an odd choice, but hey, I just work here. Animal Vegetable Mineral Man first appeared in Doom Patrol 89 in August 1964, and he is an enemy to the team, which makes sense given their weirdness. But Animal Vegetable Mineral Man here has a vendetta against the Doom Patrol's leader, the Chief, who he believed once stole an invention of his. An invention that, funnily enough, is the only way of stopping Animal Vegetable Mineral Man. But he didn't even do that, so I don't know. Look, it gets weirder and weirder, but I gotta move on. Before I do though, Animal Vegetable Mineral Man. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to get out of my system one more time. Number 1, Mr. Mind. I think anyone who hasn't heard of this villain before would be forgiven. When you think of the most fearsome villains, specifically the villains of Captain Marvel, otherwise known as Shazam, you may not first think about the 7-inch long sentient worm from Venus known as Mr. Mind. This diabolically evil mind-controlling worm, after the events of Infinite Crisis, would cocoon himself and then emerge as a massive monstrosity capable of manipulating reality, consuming universes, and traveling through time and space. He was described as eating years and events from this universe's history, altering the Earth with every flap of his wings. It took a combined effort from Booster Gold, Supernova, and Skeets to defeat Mr. Mind by trapping him inside Skeets' shell, which was fortified by the Suspendium. Then, Booster Gold threw Skeets through time with the help of Supernova to the day he was first discovered on Earth by Dr. Sivana, and then he is trapped in a time loop forever. So they didn't even actually end up ending him. They just trapped him. This all-powerful mind-controlling 7-inch long worm.
Number 10, Trapster. Oddly enough, although Trapster is a super weird and relatively obscure villain, he's still somehow made his way into a surprising number of comics. I mean, he has been around since the 60s, so considering that, I guess not so many, but we're still talking over 100 issues at least, which is pretty weird considering who Trapster is. Trapster is weird because, well, he was originally known as the guy who came armed with a glue gun, or a paste gun if you will. Initially he was known by the supervillain name Paste Pot Pete. However, Trapster has since come to loathe that name and much prefers to be called Trapster instead, as he feels the former name makes him sound lame and is often used out of disrespect for him. Admittedly, he is kinda lame though. Sorry Trapster, you might be a genius, but you still fight with glue. So anyone that fights with a glue gun, I'm just saying. Although I will say if it was a hot glue gun burns do hurt a lot. Number 9, Polka-Dot Man. You might think you know Polka-Dot Man, but do you really know him? If you've seen the Suicide Squad, you are familiar with a version of Abner Krill, but the original Polka-Dot Man, also Abner Krill of the New Earth continuity, was a little bit different when it came to his power set, at least initially. Initially when Polka-Dot Man, or Mr. Polka-Dot, first appeared, he came armed with multiple different weapons which all came from the polka dots on his suit. He could pull them off and basically turn them into any means of different weapons and devices, even once turning one into a getaway vehicle. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to talk more weird, obscure things from comics with me, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. This list actually has everything that I love. Weird, obscure, and villains. I love all of those things. Number 8, Vanisher. Vanisher was actually one of the first villains that the X-Men came up against way back in X-Men issue number 2. In short, he was weird because he gave the X-Men so much trouble, especially considering Marvel Girl was on the team and he was only a teleporter. Though at this time, they'd never encountered a teleporter before and were fairly new heroes. Also, Jean likely unknowingly had mental blocks in place. Vanisher's demise was also quite dark and odd when Professor X, who had left the X-Men to fight alone initially as a test, finally came to their aid and easily defeated Vanisher by making him forget who he was, which honestly is a pretty horrifying punishment. Don't worry though, that wouldn't be the end of Vanisher, and he'd also end up getting a much less extravagant costume. Which actually is kinda sad. I do like his original costume, with its whole thing. It's very red and patterned. Number 7, Maggie Neato. Maggie Neato appears in a humor issue of What If. She's the one who terrorizes poor old styrofoam skeleton Wolverine. She's technically supposed to be the female child version of Magneto, who is known in the comics for ripping the adamantium out of Wolverine over the course of a few horrifying panels of comics. Maggie Neato, on the other hand, doesn't need any powers to hurt her version of Wolverine, who is much more cowardly in comparison to his main continuity counterpart. Which, I mean, makes sense, considering he literally has a styrofoam skeleton. I mean, I would be afraid of Maggie Neato too, if I had a styrofoam skeleton. Also, just in general, she seems like a mean little girl. Number 6. Unis the Untouchable. Another villain who almost foiled the X-Men in their early days was Unis. Unis the Untouchable was a mutant who couldn't be touched by those who would do harm to him, making him seemingly invincible when he first came up against the X-Men in issue 8. His power was also weirdly specific, as it didn't repel all things from him, and mainly seemed to target those who fought against him and projectiles that would do him harm. Beast was the one to help defeat him when he learned of his true nature in a wrestling match against him. This was during a brief moment when Hank McCoy left the team. When Unis turned to a life of crime, Beast was the one to stop him by creating a device that intensified his power, causing everything to be repelled from Unis, including food. Starving, Unis eventually agreed to stay on the straight and narrow, and Beast returned his power levels to how they once were, allowing Unis to return to his wrestling career. Number 5. Violator. Violator was always an indie villain that haunted my nightmares as a kid. Violator is the clown character with blue face paint from the Spawn film, who was played by John Leguizamo. I love John Leguizamo, but this role, wow. Also, John Leguizamo and everything is kind of wow, it's great. Not only did he crush it, but it also felt like he kind of crushed me and my soul under the terror of the Violator. The Violator in the comics is a Spawn villain who is one of the most powerful demons of hell. He often focuses on getting Spawn to use his necro powers, trying to get him sent back to hell to become Mallah servant faster, but also serves to prepare Hellspawn for joining the army of Satan. Of course, that doesn't mean that he enjoys his job, and he often seeks to try and undermine his master. Violator is basically immortal as well. Despite dying many times, he's often reanimated shortly after in hell, only to return to torment Spawn some more. Yay. Number 4. Spook. A villain I love to talk about, but whom no one really seems to remember apparently. Val Caliban was a master escape artist who first appeared in Detective Comics back in the 70s. He was initially caught and long thought to be dead after being executed, or at least we thought he was executed, appearing in an almost ghost-inspired robe of a costume. In reality, Caliban had survived using his skills of hypnosis and escapism. He was also privy to the architectural plans of the prison as he'd worked to help design it. Thereby, he was able to exploit that knowledge and use it to escape. Honestly, it was pretty silly of them to try to put him in a prison that he'd designed, in my opinion. Years later though, he wouldn't be so lucky when changes had been made to its design and he ended up back in the prison again. And he'd be even more unlucky when he ran into Damian Wayne. It's Damian Wayne. Number 3. Elektra. Elektra makes an appearance in the 1977 What If series in issue number 34. This being a humor issue, we get to take a look at what might have happened had Elektra survived her run-in with Bullseye. Even though Elektra at this time was depicted as a villain, or, you know, at least an extremely edgy anti-hero, it seems that this one-panel take on the character has her reconsider her life of crime as a result of her near-death experience. This is pretty weird, considering I'm pretty sure at this point Elektra would have had already a few near-death experiences in her line of work as an assassin. So, like, unless she knew she was going to die here and then that's not what happened, but I feel like for her this is just an average Tuesday. Elektra even goes so far as to consider settling down and getting married, and I quote, or something. What is or something? Also, Elektra getting married just because she didn't die from Bullseye fighting her? Wow, that just seems a little unbelievable. Anything can happen in an alternate reality. Number 2. Tattered Damalian. Tattered Damalian is by all accounts a pretty weird and obscure villain who at one point was stopped by Dazzler. He doesn't really have any powers, but instead has some kind of forgotten skills, possibly. He started out initially as a tap dancer who found fame in the movies with his dancing partner Julia Walker. Knowing eventually his star would dim, he invested money in a casino in Las Vegas, but later, after he retired to run it, was swindled out of his investment and money by criminals. Following that, he became a derelict and ended up allied with the committee. He eventually would become the crazed criminal Tattered Damalian, who sought to destroy money and material possessions as a means of revenge for what had unfairly happened to him. Honestly, it seems pretty fair of him to go that route. Eventually, Daz stopped him and helped to reunite him with his former dance partner Julia Walker, but eventually she would grow tired of looking after him. Which also, fair. Number 1. Snowflame. Snowflame was originally a villain that first appeared in the 80s in DC Comics, making his first appearance in New Guardians issue number 2, and coincidentally, his last appearance as well, in the New Earth continuity anyways. Snowflame's powers are fueled by drugs, which grant him superhuman speed, strength, pyrokinesis, and made him numb to pain. He could also infect other people, intoxicating them merely by touching them. And guess what? There's more. It gets better. In 2020, he actually made a return in the Prime Earth continuity, appearing in the 2018 Catwoman series in issue number 23. So while he still remains obscure, he's also kind of recently renew as well. Yay.
Number 10. Gorgon. If you remember the weirdest DC Multiverse Superheroes video, which you should check out, I talked about a pastiche of the Incredible Hulk in DC Comics called Big Baby from Earth 8. He was part of a team called the Retaliators, who were supposed to be a joke version of the Avengers. This universe also had a team of villains called the Extremists, and on that team was a Dr. Octopus type character named Gorgon. While Gorgon did utilize technological enhancements, I think his octopus likeness comes in the form of his prehensile hair. The hair tentacles he uses and his role as a scientist mixed with his weight and oddly familiar glasses all come together to really evoke a Dr. Octopus likeness, which is just weird enough to make me double take. He is also familiar enough that I can't really put him any higher on this list, so there's that. Number 9. Dex-Starr. Or Dex-Starr, or Dexter, or Dex-Starr, Dex-Starrer. Cats can be ruthless, cold, and scary at times, I'll admit that. But while the Red Lantern of Sector 2814, Dex-Starr, is an irrationally rage-filled kitty, it's all because he loved his owner. Dex-Starr's origin shows the cat Dexter with his owner when she is attacked by robbers who broke into her home. While Dexter tried his best to scratch the attacker, he ended up ending the life of Dexter's owner. When the police showed up on the scene, Dexter was kicked out into the streets so as to not contaminate the scene. Now, 2 rascals from the streets found Dexter when he was trying to sleep, put him in a sack, and threw him into a river. Now that is one hell of a sequence of events, and all this happening filled the poor little kitty with enough rage that it caught the attention of Atrocitus, who called out to him and made him a Red Lantern. With this newfound power of the Red Lantern ring, the Rage Kitty exacted his sweet revenge on the hoodlums and flew to say goodbye to his owner one last time, saying, in his little cat language, "I find who hurt you, I kill. I good kitty." I love this cat, but I also wouldn't dare mess with it. Ever. Number 8. Prometheus. Heroes and villains with no powers always seem to be some of the most powerful. It's strange. Take Prometheus. After seeing his criminal parents pass at the hands of police, he vows a vendetta on any form of justice. A vendetta that would push him to be able to defeat the whole Justice League single-handedly. He shot the Martian Manhunter with a dart that turned his power against him and set him on fire. He infected Steel's armor with a computer virus which commanded the suit to damage the Watchtower. He hypnotized the Huntress into unconsciousness. He attacked Green Lantern with a neural chaff that rendered his ring useless. He trapped the Angel Zariel in limbo. He tricked the Flash into believing that he had planted motion-sensitive devices that would explode if the Flash used his powers. And he defeated Batman in hand-to-hand combat. That's probably the most nuts thing on this list. His origin is very similar to Batman's. After his parents were dispatched from the mortal plane, he would travel the globe training and becoming the ultimate combat machine. But he also attended the top universities, learning as much as he could. He eventually sets up a base in the Ghost Zone, and from here, he built an armor that could download information on any opponent's fighting style, kind of reminiscent of Taskmaster's ability. He is kind of crazy capable, and his vendetta on any kind of justice plus his Batman likeness just makes him kind of a little strange to me, but also terrifying. Number 7. Earth 17 Superman. On Earth 17, superheroes are a product of government experiments. The Superman of this universe, Overman, was the first, with the other superheroes being spawns of his DNA. Now that may be weird, but that ain't the weird part. He also doesn't really seem like a villain yet, does he? Well, after contracting a disease, contracting a disease from another person, yes, like that kind of disease, he goes insane. and destroys the Justice League and reduces his world to rubble. He then gets his filthy paws on a doomsday boom boom that he intends to use on Earth 17 and wipe it out. The Crisis on Infinite Earths destroyed this reality, just like DC tried to destroy such a naughty Superman story, even having different iterations of Overmans who were different, like an Overman who became allied with the Axis powers in World War II. But the internet never forgets DC Comics, and people like me exist to remind everyone of the things you published into this world. I am sorry, sort of. Thanks for the content. Number 6, Mr. Mxyzptlk. Look, I talked about Batmite when discussing heroes, and he wasn't even really a hero, so how can I not mention the first 5th dimensional imp in this video? Plus he's got a fun name. Mr. Mxyzptlk is a reality warping imp obsessed with Superman, who, just like his rival Batmite did with Batman, simply seeks to annoy the hell out of Superman and just prove he is smarter than him. Which is good, because he has a level of power that in other hands could cause the entire end of the multiverse. More on that later though. He can do almost anything imaginable if he wishes it. And his only weakness really is being convinced or tricked into saying his name backwards to send him back to the 5th dimension, which, if you're trying to say it correctly, is honestly a superpower in and of itself. Clitopizixum. I got it.
And for Midnight Man. Originally a collector of art, Anton Mogart would commit robberies at the stroke of midnight to build his collection. When Moon Knight stops him, he seemingly drowns in a river, but instead, he ends up becoming deformed by the waste found within the sewers. Then he goes insane and starts collecting trash, and teams with Bushman to defeat their sworn enemy. When Midnight Man finds out he's dying from cancer, he decides to find his son, hoping that he can share some of his final moments with him. Mogart does what he can to stop his son from turning to a life of crime like he once did, and in the wake of his death, he becomes the hero Midnight. It didn't last, and he ended up becoming a cyborg for the Secret Empire, which, while sounding bad, I think it would be kinda cool, like, to be a cyborg. Like, as long as I still have, like, my free will, and my programming isn't controlling me, because that just doesn't sound like fun. Like, I want to be able to turn my arm into a giant cannon. That'd be great. Someone tries to mug me, I'm just like, sorry. Getting close to the end, in number 3, Seth Falcon. He belongs to a Scottish sect of Knights Templar and has several amazing powers. I'll never do that accent again. Falcon first appeared in Mark Spector Moon Knight number 43. Seth Falcon is immortal, has superhuman strength and stamina, but his strongest power is his touch. Using his clawed fingers, Falcon can drain the life force out of any living being, aging them in the process. If he holds his grip for long enough, Seth can drain the entire life out of somebody, all of it, turning them into a rotted skeleton. However, there's a catch. Due to biofeedback, the draining process backfires if Seth uses it on anybody who shares his DNA code, even partially. Simply put, he can't drain his relatives because it causes a series of issues that then hurts and weakens his powers. And yep, that's right. You guessed it, of course, Moon Knight turns out to be one of his long-lost relatives, so Falcon has to rely on his superhuman strength and stamina to outlast Mark Spector in any mutual fight. Which is good, because that kind of like levels the playing field. Penultimately, in at number 2, Cactus. Sometimes a name is just a name. It can have meaning, or it could just be something cool that the guy thought of that ended up kind of making sense. Other times names are extremely direct and are probably too on point. That's the case with Cactus, who is exactly what he sounds like and nothing more. Created by Dominus, he's been a villain of the West Coast Avengers and Moon Knight on various occasions. Punching him definitely stings, but beyond that, it doesn't take all that much to break him or chop him up, because, you know, he's a cactus, which has actually happened before, though he can regenerate lost limbs, which I don't know if cactuses can do or cacti can do, but yeah, he's without a doubt one of the lamest villains in the Marvel Universe, but in my opinion, that makes him one of the coolest. This guy is literally a cactus, and that's hilarious. A couple years ago, the girl I was with at the time and I came up with a superhero that we called Cact Guy, who was basically in essence Cactus, and we didn't know that it was actually a thing. But it's funny to me that someone actually made this and then put it in the goddamn Marvel Universe. That's hilarious, that's amazing, and Cactus is my new favorite villain ever because of that. Hashtag Cactus in the MCU. And finally, in at number 1, Hunter's Moon. Dr. Batter was born in Luxor, Egypt to 2 doctors and was an excellent student throughout his life, eventually becoming a doctor as well. He grew to become a very rational and serious person who didn't believe in any higher entities, despite still attending prayer and studying the Quran and the Hadith. This all changed when he was attacked by vampires and left to die on the streets, at which point he met the Egyptian moon god Khonshu. Dr. Batter survived and became a worshipper of Khonshu, who fancied himself the god's second highest priest, and opposite of Mark Spectre. After learning that Moon Knight had taken in vampires under his protection, Dr. Batter terrorized the Nightwalkers to get his attention. Hunter's Moon eventually confronted Moon Knight, chastised him for taking in enemies of Khonshu, and expressed his intentions to correct him. Dr. Batter beat Moon Knight and invaded the Midnight Mission to kill the vampires, but Spectre recovered and knocked him unconscious after attacking him from behind. Which, you know what, after beating him, I'm not even gonna call it, that's kinda shady. I respect it. Starting us off in at number 10, Vlad Plasmius. In the world of Danny Phantom, there exists a select few individuals with the ability to transition between a human form and a ghost form. One of these is Danny Fenton, the other is a female clone of him named Danny Fenton, but the third is probably the most important one, Vlad Plasmius, also known as Vlad Masters, Amity Park's mayor and Danny's dad's old college friend who's in love with his wife. Yeah. Vlad is secretly a human-ghost hybrid, actually the first to come into existence, following an accident that was caused by a college experiment that he was working on with Jack and Maddie, which are Danny's parents, in which Vlad gained his powers. Having been a half-ghost for the last 20 years, he serves as the main antagonist of the series, acting as just Danny's ultimate villain. But I mean, being a human-ghost hybrid and being the reason Danny Phantom goes dark in another timeline where his family's blown up is certainly worthy of getting him on this list. Plus, I love Danny Phantom. Butch, send me a pop figure, please. I couldn't find one.
Number 9. Haziral. Haziral is the demon who possesses the leader of the Rat Queens, Hannah. Hannah is an elven necromancer in the series whose very existence as well as the type of magic she practiced made her controversial while growing up. As such, she ends up making a pact with the demon Haziral to get access to magic so that she can pass her classes at Mage U. This prompts her to grow horns and also makes her indebted and permanently bonded to the demon. Using such dark magic has consequences, of course, and when she taps into it, it can cause Hannah to go kind of into a pretty crazy frenzy, losing control over herself as her darker side and the demon within her takes over. In Rat Queens, Hannah was prompted to use this power again to save her friends and fellow Rat Queens after years of resisting the temptation of said demonic power. Unfortunately, this also meant she would have to confront Haziral after years of staving off the demon's power and influence. In a way, Haziral is also like a symbol for Hannah's own inner demons, though he is himself literally a demon with his own wants and desires. Both a symbol and an actual demon. Mainly, he loves Hannah and he wants to continue to be as close to her at any cost. Which is obviously not very good for her, but Hannah also has a lot of shit that she needs to work out, so yeah.
And it ain't Dave. Dave's origin is unknown as of yet, but it is heavily inferred that he was like the other thousands of robots in the series, created by humans to serve a certain task. However, the robots became advanced enough to form their own conscious thoughts, so of course they revolted and killed off the entire human race. It was shown that Dave was one of the robots that served in combat and also helped fight off numerous alien races, and after the wars, robots seemed to act entirely like humans, adopting their culture and their way of life. Dave had a wife named Sally, who he actually later divorced because apparently even robot girlfriends are unbearable, and a son called Scotty. However, he is now a nobody working as an office drone, which only makes him more of a villain, despite being the protagonist of the story, because like, given that he wiped out the entire human race, I think it's safe to say that he's a villain.
Number 7. Crazy Quilt. Crazy Quilt actually might sound familiar to you in terms of his overall personality and demeanor, as it seems like the version of Polka-Dot Man that we saw in the Suicide Squad, to me at least, is actually closer to a combination of the original Polka-Dot Man mixed with, well, this villain, Crazy Quilt. Crazy Quilt was Paul Decker, a painter and criminal who left clues in his artwork as to his criminal plots. Eventually, he was apprehended, left blinded by a gunshot wound in the scuffle. He would regain his sight through an experimental procedure where his optic nerves were attached to a helmet, but the blinding colors that he would see would cause him to go insane. At least when I was watching the Suicide Squad, I was like, this Polka-Dot Man kinda reminds me of Polka-Dot Man mixed with Crazy Quilt, cause he's so crazy.
And at 6, Death. We all love a good rendition of death, right? Of course we do, that's like the foundation of any good comic storyline. Well, in East of West, the whole story is about death, with this version of the Horseman being the protagonist of the series. And not only is he the Horseman of Death, but they're actually a horseman as well, considering how East of West is Wild West themed. However, this time around, Death, formerly of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, fell in love with someone named Xyloan, something like that. I probably butchered it, but oh well. And then had a son with her, which is a whole other can of worms. Presumably killed by Bel Solomon of the Chosen though. He survived with the help of Wolf and Crow. Since then, the White Horseman embarked on a quest for revenge over his wife and son. And in the most recent incarnation, Death possessed skin that was jet black instead of the pure white skin that he has now. He was also the only horseman who didn't get a gender change in the new reincarnation. Alright, I mean it's Death, so Death is genderless. But I mean, he may be good in the story though, but I think it's safe to say that Death before the series was a pretty, well, like, death-loving guy. Self-love.
Number 5, Thanos. Another one of my favorites has to come from the What If Disney Plus streaming show, where we actually got to see what Thanos would be like if he were on the side of good. So technically here, I guess he's a hero, but of course in the main continuity we know him better as a villain, both in the comics and the MCU, so yeah. Thanos ends up joining the Ravagers and becoming a close ally of Star-Lord in episode 2 of the show, where we get to explore what the world would be like if T'Challa, instead of Peter Quill, ended up as Star-Lord. And guess what? Turns out the world would potentially be, a lot better for it, minus the imminent doom of the universe as a result of Ego's plot to kinda like take it over, but ignoring that. Other than that, it was doing pretty well for itself, I gotta say. Thanos didn't even snap half the universe out of existence in this reality, and all because T'Challa convinced him not to do so by simply talking him down. Man, where was Black Panther when that was happening before? Why didn't he just come in and be like, hey, look, Thanos, no. Maybe he's gotta travel in space before he can have those conversational skills, maybe that's why?
In it for Nemesis. At the start of this series, the supervillain Nemesis destroys a building in Tokyo, killing a SWAT team and a police inspector. In Washington DC, the FBI informs Metro Police Chief Inspector Blake Morrow that Nemesis is targeting him next. Haha. Wonderful. He's given a card reading Black Morrow, March 12th at midnight, flatline still counts. Morrow has his family put in protective custody, and then Nemesis hijacks Air Force One over the District of Columbia, taking the United States president hostage and crashing the plane. Nemesis makes an international broadcast, revealing the president as a hostage in front of him, and then finishing it off by saying, "It's time you hail your new chief." Nemesis reveals to his henchman that his real name is Matt Anderson, and his father had committed suicide after Morrow tried to imprison him for hunting runaway teenagers with his rich friends. Bored of well behavior and less excitement, Anderson traveled around the world to learn the ways of crime, hoping to fulfill his mother's dying wish to have Morrow killed. So I think you can understand that this guy is pretty messed up and a powerful villain.
Number 3, Gaggy. Gaggy was the sidekick of Joker. Before there was Harley Quinn, there was Gaggy. Although to be clear, Joker and Gaggy were not in a romantic relationship. Just thought I'd point that out. They were simply partners in crime. In fact, when Harley did start coming around, it was later revealed that Gaggy actually became jealous of her, and even that she was perhaps the reason for Gaggy's fall from glory in the Joker's eyes. At least that was how Gaggy saw it. He basically blamed Harley for all of it. More recently, Gaggy made a reappearance in the Batman 3 Jokers limited series, but sadly, he was killed off in that book, being eaten by a Joker shark. R.I.P. Gaggy. I love how Gaggy came back and then they were like, he's dead. I was like, oh, okay. Bye.
Penultimately, in number 2, Overlord. A superpowered crime lord who operates out of Chicago, he is the archenemy of the Savage Dragon and the leader of Vicious Circle. There have been 3 people who had this mantle though: Antonio Spaghetti, who I keep trying to call Antonio Spaghetti, Victor Nixon, and Flash Mercury. Antonio Spaghetti grew up in Chicago around the time of Al Capone and became fascinated with the mafia way of life. When his sister was being in an alleyway, the 8-year-old Spaghetti stabbed the man responsible and claimed his first victim. This act led to a life of crime, and he soon came under the wing of a man who would become Octopus, whilst also rising up through the ranks of the Mafia. Once he had reached a position of authority in the Mafia, Spaghetti vowed that he would never lose his power, but his position came under threat when a superpowered freak became the dominant figures in Chicago's crime sector. Seeking resources and methods with which to cement his leadership position in Chicago, Spaghetti forced alliances with the Nation of Lieberheim and cyberdata organizations, and as well became Overlord, because that's what you do.
Number 1, Lady Death. because, you know, one comic book version of Death wasn't enough, so we had to do another one. Lady Death is one of the most powerful female supervillains out there, as she is literally the embodiment of death. And if you think you know about this Lady Death, you might not, because we're not talking about the one from Marvel. She hails from the bad girl comic days, where it was trendy for female characters to be bad, whether that be bad as anti-heroes, full-on heroes, or villains. In Lady Death's case, she was mainly known as a villain. She first debuted with Chaos Comics, but has changed publishers since her initial appearance with them. Lady Death originally was the beautiful and sexy woman who seduced Ernest Fairchild into becoming a full-on psychotic killer, who would later become known as Evil Ernie. As such, her first appearance was in Evil Ernie issue number 1 in the original black and white 1991 series. The Evil Ernie War of the Dead series finishes with Ernie managing to kill everyone on Earth in order to win Lady Death's favor. He does so by instigating an all-out nuclear war, ending the story with a mushroom cloud, and then ending the story again with a mushroom cloud of his face. Evil Ernie never dies.